Thanks for listening to the Duval Rundown, brought to you by Injury Care Centers. Your path to recovery starts here. Now here's your host, Gus Logue.
Good morning and welcome to episode 17 of Duval Rundown. My name is Gus Logue, joined today, as I am on every Thursday morning, by Mia O'Brien, co-host of Helmets and Heels on 1010XL. We are going to get to a conversation about Chicago Bears versus Jacksonville Jaguars this weekend, what we've seen, what we want to see from youngsters like Tank Bigsby and Brian Thomas Jr. But first, we're going to start out, as we do every show, with a little bit of Jaguars trivia. The Jaguars have a 6-5 all-time record in London, including 2-0 at Tottenham Hotspur Stadium, where they're playing the Bears this weekend. Which team did the Jaguars defeat in their first ever win across the pond?
Was it 2-0 that 2-0 at Tottenham? Wow, Gus, I didn't even put 2 and 2 together. That's an interesting one.
There you go, undefeated in that stadium. Was the team that the Jags beat first in London, the Niners in 2013, the Cowboys in 2014, the Bills in 2015, or the Colts in 2016. Those are each of the Jaguars' first 4 London matchups. And the correct answer is C. Their first win came against the Bills in 2015. Alan Hearns was the player of that game. I think most fans can remember his touchdown to the corner of the end zone. But yeah, fast forward now to 2024. And the Jaguars will be playing their 12th ever game over there in the United Kingdom. They played most of them. What's the other stadium? I forget. Wembley.
Yep.
Yeah, most of them at Wembley, but they are 2-0 at Tottenham, and they're playing at Tottenham this weekend, and then they're playing at Wembley next weekend when they play the Patriots. But Mia, we wanted to talk today about the Bears' defense mostly and how this kind of rejuvenated Jaguars offense has recently found a rhythm. Can maybe attack the Bears defense. We mostly talked about Chicago's offense with Caleb Williams and Rome Odunze and company with Taylor on Tuesday. But I wanted to keep diving further into the defense because, as I mentioned on Tuesday with Taylor, Chicago has not allowed more than 21 points in a game since November of last season, week 11 of 2023. And so this defense under Matt Eberflus has really rounded into form recently, really going back to after their bye week last year, and they have been one of the better defensive units in football. And I know that they have generated a lot of takeaways, but it's not just the takeaways. It's a mix of both coaching and talent. And so, Mia, just starting off with Chicago's defense, what is like the main thing that you think of when you think of the Bears?
Yeah, I think that the personnel is loaded across the board, especially comparatively to what the Jaguars faced a week ago in the Indianapolis Colts. I've heard from a couple of our listeners at 1010XL throughout the course of this week so far that because Trevor Lawrence has had such success against Gus Bradley's cover 3, that because the Bears run cover 3 43.7% of the time, that is easily their most used coverage through 5 weeks of the NFL season. And we'll get into kind of the nitty gritty of week 3, because I think that proved to be a turning point, not only for the Bears on offense, but as a collective. I'm sure we'll get into that. But just because they run a similar defense to the Colts does not mean that therefore the Jags offense that has been revitalized, if only for 1 week, is going to have similar success against the Bears this week. Because even without Jaquan Brisker, this is still a defense that, if you want to look at Gus Bradley's lineage and his history in Seattle, part of why the cover 3 had such success with the Legion of Boom was because they had the dudes to run that type of defense, both along the defensive front and in the secondary. When you think of the Bears, I think historically speaking, because you think of the monsters of the Midway, you think of sacks, you think of a strong, beefy defensive front. And while certainly Gervon Dexter, the Florida Gator grad, is the leader in sacks and certainly fits that profile, I think when it comes to the best playmakers on this defense, it does lie in that secondary. No Jaquan Brisker, as alluded to. He suffered a concussion last week, has already been ruled out for this game. Kyler Gordon, for anyone who watched HBO's Hard Knocks this offseason, you saw what a hard hitter and a hard-nosed nickel corner he is. I would put him arguably in the top 3, top 5 in the league, at least through 5 weeks of the season at the position. Jaylen Johnson is playing like a top 10 corner right now. Tyreek Stevenson, the Miami grad, has been a more than suitable corner number 2 for the Bears. And I think the biggest question mark for them is that second safety spot in place of Brisker, which at this juncture, I mean, you're looking at a world in which it's some combination of Kevin Byard, Elijah Hicks, and Mr. Simone Biles, Jonathan Owens, which I think that in and of itself, teams, including the Indianapolis Colts, would die on the vine to have that sort of depth in their secondary. And so I think this is, if only in terms of personnel, going to be a large step up for the Jaguars offense compared to the group that they played last week that was so depleted in Indianapolis.
Yeah, absolutely. It's arguably the worst secondary in the league last week against the Colts compared to this week going against arguably the best secondary in the NFL in Chicago. And yeah, you're right. Even with Jaquan Brisker out, who's an ascending safety and one of the best young defenders in the league, they still got Kyler Gordon, Tyreek Stevenson, and of course the All-Pro Jaylen Johnson at cornerback. So it'll be a tough test.
I do want to ask you. I want to ask you this, Gus, with regards to Brisker. What do you view him as? I actually asked Kevin this morning because when Brisker was coming out of Penn State, like I had this view of he's more of a center fielder. And in talking, of course, to our coworker, Taylor Dahl, who not only covers the Jags, but also covers the Bears, she said that he's really more of a strong safety, crowd the box type of guy. And so that's what I'm most curious when we're looking at who could replace him in this lineup for the Bears. That's what I'm curious is what will that person be asked to do?
Yeah, I think coming out of college, I saw him definitely as like a high up safety, whether it was 1 high or 2 high, but mostly playing that center fielder type position. And now he's really just kind of asked to do a lot of things all over the place. I've got his snaps for the season pulled up from PFF. So far this year, he has 105 snaps in the box, 159 snaps at free safety, and 21 snaps at slot cornerback. So he's still playing free safety a little bit more often, but it's really, I think the thing is, like you see this with the majority of defenses now, is that it's not just a free safety and a strong safety. Really, those two are interchangeable, and they'll move up or back from the line of scrimmage depending on, I don't know, just what the play call is and what the offense is doing and how the offense is lining up. So I think Brisker is like, even though I agree with you, he was more of a middle fielder type guy coming out of college, he's really grown into a do everything kind of guy. But that definitely, even though the Bears secondary is still extremely talented, I feel like he's probably the second best guy that they have behind Jaylen Johnson. And so now I feel like their strategy for the Jaguars can almost be like, let's go away from Jaylen Johnson. And it feels like the same way on the defensive line where it's, let's just go away from Montez Sweat, because I know they've got Gervin Dexter, the Florida Gator, and they've added a few like kind of key role players in the offseason between the draft pick that they got, Austin Booker out of Kansas, and then Darrell Taylor, who Taylor and I were talking about on Tuesday, picked him up as a free agent from Seattle, maybe on waivers actually. And so they definitely have other guys, but at the same time, like when Jacksonville's coaches and players were asked about Chicago's defense this week, they kind of said, oh, like you got to worry about Sweat, and then they brought a few other guys too. And so I feel like you really need to worry about Montez Sweat on the defensive line, Jaylen Johnson in the secondary. And if you can kind of avoid those two as well as you can, then you might actually have a decent shot to succeed. And so what do you think like the strategy should be for Jacksonville, Mia?
Right. Well, what I was going to say, Gus, is where do you think the Bears will line up those 2 star players? Because for me, especially with this episode being dedicated to looking at the Bears defense, but also the emergence of Brian Thomas Jr. and Tank Bigsby, I can't help but feel like if Kyler Gordon is going to be guarding the slot and therefore by default Christian Kirk most of the time, I think Jaylen Johnson's going to be given the assignment of Brian Thomas Jr., and Brian Thomas Jr. is getting that wide receiver 1 treatment. That is what I've been so curious to see in this early part of the season. We all know what he's been able to do, and I think that the numbers and the measurables and the success rate suggest that even once teams do start accounting for him, rolling safety help over the top, trying to bring some sort of double team coverage for the rookie out of LSU, he's still going to find ways to succeed. Maybe if it's not at the rate that he's finding success right now. But for me, undoubtedly, especially with the slow start for Gabe Davis, which I do think he will come around. I do want to make that note. Like, I think Gabe will be an important part of this offense. If anything, I think as this offense evolves, they need to be reminded that, well, certainly Gabe Davis was signed with the goal of making another field stretcher opposite Calvin Ridley or Brian Thomas Jr. a reality. He was also signed to be a red zone threat, a high ball, go up and get it artist in the red zone, which we will get to a little bit later in the program, because for me, that is perhaps the answer to how the Jaguars can finally put points on the board at a consistent rate. And so I think that Jalen Johnson will be given the assignment exclusively of shadowing Brian Thomas Jr., which I think Brian Thomas Jr. is going to revel in that opportunity, because we really haven't seen, and maybe it's because of the personnel up to this point, a corner, at DB1 going up against the Jaguars' new wide receiver one. And I think that that'll be fascinating to see. And as for Sweat, as opposed to the Chris Jones and the Myles Garretts of the world, he could certainly move up and down the line, but he doesn't move up and down the line quite at the rate that those other two pass rushers do. I don't envision seeing him lining up on a guard personally. Maybe you have a different opinion on that. So I think it's going to have to be another big day at the office for Anton Harrison and Cam Robinson.
Yeah, I agree with you on Sweat, where I think he's basically a defensive end and he lines up that way. Like, maybe he's used on stunts and gets inside more that way, but it's not like he's like used like some other players that are like weaponized against interior offensive linemen and standing up across from them before the snap. You don't really see that as much with Sweat. And then I actually think that I'll be surprised if Jalen Johnson did shadow Brian Thomas, just because I don't think the Bears typically do that. And even against like guys like Nico Collins and Jamar Chases and those types, they haven't done it. But even still, like Thomas Jr. will see close to a majority of the snaps, if not more, against Jalen Johnson. So that's definitely a big matchup for him. We do want to talk about just Brian Thomas and Tank Bigsby too. So while we're talking about Brian Thomas, just like, what do you need to see from him in this game? He's had a great start to his rookie season. There was a stat that he ranks third among all rookie receivers since at least the year 2000 in yards per route run, behind only Jamar Chase and I forget who the number one was. But yeah, he ranks third in the first 5 weeks for any rookie receiver. So he's had a great start. But what do you want to see from him in order to kind of like take a next step, especially against a defense where like you really need your stars to shine in order to put up more than 21 points?
Well, allow for me to explain the bottom line, the rundown here on Duval Rundown this morning, Gus. The race to 21, which I added the trademark to on our Twitter post, is in large part a homage to my friends over at One Shining Podcast of the Ringer Network. In the college basketball world, they refer to teams that struggle on offense as the race to 69, and teams that are just trying to get to 69 points in a basketball game. Right now, the Jacksonville Jaguars are averaging 19.4 points per game. We are quite literally in the race to 21 points, Gus. And when you and I sat down to map out today's episode, we said that the two biggest answers to the race to 21, the solutions for the Jaguars to finally consistently get over that hump, are Brian Thomas Jr. and Tank Bigsby. And so let's begin with BTJ, as you said. I think that the Bears have held every quarterback they have faced up to this point below their season average. I also think it's important to look at the quarterbacks that they faced. Of course, depending on your view of Trevor Lawrence, you could say that he is in the same camp as Will Levis and Anthony Richardson, as opposed to in the camp of quarterbacks like Matthew Stafford, who the Bears have also held below his season average, or CJ Stroud, who they've also held below his season average, although you could argue that that was that defense's worst offensive output. When it comes to BTJ, what I think is really interesting is that I went through rushing stats for the top rushers, and this is with the intent of trying to come up with some stats for Tank Bigsby, who we'll get to here in a second. I went through missed tackles forced per rush attempts. And granted, it's because he only has one attempt. But Brian Thomas Jr. is number 2 in the National Football League right now in missed tackles forced per rush attempt. I'm not suggesting that the Jags need to be running jet sweeps every other play, especially in light of Devin Duvernay's injury and being placed on the reserve injured list yesterday. I think now by default, you'll see more Brian Thomas Jr. and Christian Kirk and perhaps Parker Washington on jet sweeps. I do think you could incorporate it a little more, but it speaks to, number one, the speed of Brian Thomas Jr. FTN Fantasy had his true speed size at 118.9, which would be second among all running backs in the 2024 draft class. What that means is that if you can get this guy out in space, and we saw it on that 85-yard touchdown run, if you can get him out in space, he is one of one when it comes to wide receivers in open space with the ball in their hands, and that second gear that he hit on the final 20-plus yards of that run. And so that's why I think, yes, it's important for him to win a one-on-one matchup. He's proven he can do that. But this is where the Jaguars have to not only scheme up plays that give him that opportunity to go one-on-one with the defender, but what you saw this past weekend, which I do think even with an elevation in the skill set of the personnel on defense for the Bears compared to the Colts, I do think this is where Trevor Lawrence and company have to be disciplined. Take what's underneath. Take what they are giving you, and then you will be afforded that opportunity when whoever is stepping in for Jaquan Brisker tries to crowd the box. That's when you have that opportunity. And that Brian Thomas Jr. touchdown in particular, you can see it when you watch the All-22. It's a hitch route from Renton Strange. And the moment that he curves and he turns in his route, you see the safeties start shading in. And that's when BTJ and Trevor Lawrence knew. And so I don't think that's an isolated incident. I think, we kind of saw it in the Houston Texans matchup as well. And so I believe those plays will be there independent of how good this Bears defense is because of how good Brian Thomas Jr. is and because of how many weapons the Jaguars, quite frankly, have.
Yeah, mine is kind of similar to yours where it's just like all about consistency, where we saw the big play, the 85-yarder, which was the second longest catch by a Jaguar in team history.
Which is insane, by the way. Like, that's very hard to wrap your head around.
And number one was Allen Robinson. It's not like it was Jimmy or Keenan. But, yeah, it's all about consistency because in the NBA, like, you have guys who can just sub in and get you a couple three-pointers. But then, especially in the playoffs, like, it doesn't really matter how good your play calling is. Like, you need a couple guys, not even just one guy, but a couple guys who can go and get you a bucket. And that's what I want to see from both Brian Thomas Jr. and Tank Bigsby. Is like, it was great to see that 85-yarder, but he was also wide open. And that was like the kind of play that you expected Thomas Jr. to succeed in when he walked into the NFL with that great speed score that you mentioned. Just a walking big play waiting to happen. But I wanted to see if he can be more consistent, like he did show last week too, by like picking up 9 yards on a first down wide receiver screen, and then making a nice catch, kind of that was on a throw that was behind him to protect him from an incoming hit over the middle on a dig route, picking up a first down there. And so, like, being able to pick up a lot of first downs, especially on third downs, like when the defense knows that that the offense needs a bucket, can he go out and perform and kind of like pick up the hard-nosed, hard-fought, just first downs that the team needs in order to set up those deep shots like you were talking about. And
did we just become a basketball podcast, Gus Logue?
That's what I think so, yeah. When you were doing your...
Brian Thomas Jr. played basketball, well documented.
So a lot of times, like, I know that Nate Tice really likes talking about quarterbacks and being able to go and get a bucket. But, I mean, for the NFL, like, you're not just relying on one guy, you're relying on all 11 guys on the offense, but especially the guy who's throwing and catching the ball. And so I think that Trevor Lawrence, we all agree, even if he also needs to get more consistent, he's a guy that can go and get you a bucket when you need one, but he still needs a guy on the receiving end. And so we've seen a little bit of Evan Engram, mostly Christian Kirk, kind of in that role of like being the guy on third downs and as like the chain mover. But I think if Brian Thomas Jr. can not just be like the guy that's getting you juice with an 85-yard catch, but is also the guy that's moving the chains for you consistently and getting you a bucket in that regard, then that would be huge. And especially, like, if he doesn't show that for the rest of the season, then it's not a huge deal because I think he just turned 22 years old yesterday, and, like, he's already been more than anyone could ask for. But, like, that would be the next step that I'm looking for him, and I'm looking for it from him specifically this week, again, because it's just such a good Bears defense that does not allow a lot, and, like, you just need that kind of bucket-getting ability, I guess, in this type of matchup.
And I think that, and again, not to point this back at the play caller, but I do think that you have to create those opportunities. Last year, we saw Calvin Ridley pigeonholed into, we need you to win off the line of scrimmage from the release point, which was not something that was in his skill set, but it was something the offense needed. Now you have the player that, yes, that is part of his skill set, but don't pigeonhole him into he is solely an X or a Z wide receiver who's just going to run go routes. Like that's not who he is. And he has stressed that to us since he arrived in Jacksonville. He can do a whole heck of a lot of things. That's why I referenced the jet sweep, the fact that he can provide opportunities for you on screens like you alluded to, Gus. And so don't pigeonhole him into this is all he can be, is this downfield artist. He can do that, but how you lull those defenses to sleep and you make them forget that that is his bread and butter is by putting him in all those other situations.
Yeah, and not that you're saying this, but the Jaguars have been doing that. Honestly, since the beginning of the season, it's been like better kind of deployment, I would say, even than Calvin Ridley last year, which is kind of weird because Calvin Ridley, like you already had so much game tape of when he was a professional football player, whereas Brian was kind of like this just raw college prospect coming out. The Jaguars, since week one, have done a good job of like putting him in a bunch of different spots to succeed. And it's not like he has the most diverse route tree in the world or in the league, but it's not like he should because he is a raw college prospect. But still, like they've done a good job moving him around the formation, not only setting him deep, but also being used like on screens and in different looks, having him be the primary option in the red zone, which I think that he had the one like red zone touchdown against the Texans, but that might be the only one. But I think that as the season goes on, we're going to see more production from him in the red zone because not just in the red zone, but everywhere the Jaguars have been doing the right thing in terms of how they're deploying him and getting him creative looks. And so it's really just on Thomas Jr. and Lawrence to continue executing those looks.
Speaking of the red zone, Gus, in answering the question, the race to 21 and how the Jaguars get over the hill, I mentioned it. The easy answer to how the Jaguars can score more than 21 points consistently game over game is by simply scoring in the red zone. As we know, if Travis Etienne doesn't fumble on the 2-yard line against the Miami Dolphins, the Jaguars win that game going away. If they quite simply could convert and not settle for in 2 trips downfield into the red zone, and you settle for 3 points total, that's an 11-point swing. If you could turn those field goals and those turnovers on downs into touchdowns, we are looking at a completely different trajectory for this offense. And I think that's why there is such belief in the building and such belief in that locker room that it is just a matter of inches. If they can get those conversions, if they can convert in the red zone, then everything else is going to feel a little bit easier. I do want to note, because last year the struggles on 3rd and short, 4th and short, and in the red zone were, of course, because the Jaguars were getting stuffed at the line of scrimmage. They are 30th right now in stuff rate percentage. They're not getting stuffed by any stretch of the imagination in the run game, which is part of the Tank Bigsby effect, which we'll get to here in just a second. Now, when it comes to the Bears' red zone defense, and let's focus on that portion of the field, they are currently the 5th best red zone defense in the National Football League. They allow opponents to convert on just 38.5% of their trips to the red zone. Opponents are scoring on 30% of their offensive drives against the Bears as a whole. And so certainly, yes, this is a top 10 defense once again in the early goings of the 2024 season. But I think what's important to note is of the 4 total touchdowns that the Bears have allowed in the red zone, 3 of them have been rushing scores. They are also allowing a 3-point rushing yards per attempt in that shortened part of the field. And of course, we know who is currently leading the National Football League in yards per attempt, none other than Cartavius Tank Bigsby. And that is why I say in the Jaguars' efforts, Gus, to succeed in the red zone and the Jaguars' efforts to win the race to 21, Tank Bigsby, much like Brian Thomas Jr., has to be a part of the equation.
Oh, absolutely. And I think we've seen that so far. I know that Doug Peterson said on Monday that part of the reason Tank got kind of extended workload in the second half of last week's game was because of a shoulder injury that Etienne nicked or kind of picked up. But even still, like, I feel like it was also kind of partly them just riding the hot hand because Tank deserved to get more and more touches. And I think that's exactly what the Jags have been looking for in like kind of a second back to mix in with Travis Etienne, or at least like not even from a specific back, but just what they're looking for from their running game in general is the ability to kind of give them the ball over and over and be able to go finish and win games like we saw in Tank's 58-yarder. But then as we saw in Tank's other touchdown in the red zone with the one where Ezra Cleveland kind of pushed him from behind, like you need that in the red zone. you need that ability to just fight for every inch and have just the will to want to do that. And so, like, there was the assumption that just having Mitch Morse plugged in at center over Luke Forward would kind of solve a lot of issues. But
it solved the stuff rate percentage clearly. Like,
yeah, I was going to say we've actually seen that's been a big difference. And then, like I've said, I think on one of last week's shows, that the Jags in like critical situations, like the goal line or 3rd and 4th and 1 and stuff like that, they've gotten a little bit too cute. But honestly, when they just go straight behind Morse's back and into the interior, they've had a pretty good success rate. And I think that does kind of start and end with Tank Bigsby, because I know myself and Coach Campo and a bunch of other people at this point have kind of said that I still think that for sure Travis Etienne is better running back, and I don't want to make this about that, but I do think that Tank Bigsby.
I have the stats if we want to do that argument, Gus. We're ready to have that conversation, that dialogue again.
We'll hold on for a little bit, but Tank does have really good vision, really good eyes, really good just a feel for when and where to cut, and that's especially big in tight spaces when you're running in between the tackles. And so I would expect to continue to see Tank Bigsby utilized. In general, of course, but especially in the red zone in those critical situations.
So Tank Bigsby right now is first in rushing EPA, expected play average. I'm doing that right. Words are hard. It's 9:30 in the morning. He's first in rushing yards over expected average. So first in the league. He has a 50% success rate in running the football. He is first, as we alluded to, in yards per carry at 8.0 yards, which is a walking first down. Press Taylor, I hope you are listening. A walking first down in your backfield. Travis Etienne has a 56.6% success rate. He's 18th in rushing EPA, and he's 27th in yards per carry. As much as you look at that and you say there's 32 teams, oh no, well, all 32 teams have multiple running backs. So I don't think he's that far off. I also think that yards per carry number is low because for the first 3 to 4 games of the season, especially the Browns game when Tank went down with an injury on a special teams kickoff return, the Jags were forced to use Travis Etienne in the red zone, which quite frankly, unless you're getting him out in space, is not his forte. And so I think part of why that number is so low is just by virtue of they were putting him in situations where he can't succeed just because that's not really who he is. When you're asking Travis Etienne to be trying to grind out and get you an inside zone run for 2 or 3 yards and grind it out, can he do it? Yes, but not at the success rate that Tank Bigsby can. But as that 56.6% success rate suggests, it's not to say when you're handing Travis Etienne the football, you have less of an opportunity to create a successful play than if you're handing it off to Tank Bigsby. If anything, the numbers tell you you have a higher percentage chance of creating a successful running play. And so, look, it can coexist. We've said it, I think, at nauseum on this program. We've said it at nauseum on 1010XL. Look at the Detroit Lions. They have 2 incredibly capable running backs with 2 very different skill sets right now, and they can coexist. You can have both Tank Bigsby and Travis Etienne, especially when, again, let's go back to that red zone stat. If you are to exploit the Chicago Bears in any form or fashion in the red zone, the numbers suggest your best opportunity to do so is on the ground. And you have 2 of the NFL's premier running backs at this juncture. So use them, please. I'm sick and tired of hearing the national program saying what we already knew, Gus, which is the Jaguars are not running the ball, but when they are running the ball, they're a top 10 unit, top 5 unit in the National Football League. So why aren't you doing it more?
I feel like they've tried, or they tell themselves they want to kind of establish the run and commit to the run. But then, I don't know, I guess it doesn't help having a franchise quarterback who just signed a big deal and can throw at any level of the field. They probably just get a little bit carried away by that fact. But yeah, I'm glad you brought up those numbers because obviously Tank is having an amazing season, but it's not like Travis is having a bad season. And I think the disparity with the yards per carry, because it seemed like it was fairly similar success rates, but then Tank is just breaking off long runs and getting past the 2nd and 3rd levels more than Etienne has, which is funny because that's almost like Etienne's specialty. Obviously, Etienne has the amazing acceleration and long speed, but he also, I think his best trait, honestly, is his contact balance. And I think that's why the prospect comparisons when he was coming out of Clemson to Alvin Kamara made sense is because he was so good at just absorbing contact and making it seem like it was nothing and just bouncing off guys, especially at those second and third levels where it's more of just secondary players and like safety types, as opposed to bigger linebackers who can bring you to the ground. Or Travis would usually just bounce off of those guys. And so I expect him to kind of like get back to it sooner than later, where it's not like he's having like a putrid season. Again, like ETN is still having a nice year, but I think it could even get even more better on the ground efficiency wise if he just keeps going at it and is able to break a few tackles like we've seen in years past his ability to do. It feels like that ability has gone over to Tank for this year, but I think they both do have that ability. And so I agree with you where they have to kind of keep on keeping at it against this good Bears defense.
And I think you and hopefully my microphone's working. I switched my audio. You still got me, right, Gus? Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. I think it's important to also note that the Jaguars, while certainly the expectation was with the personnel and what this coaching staff wants to do, the expectation was they're an outside zone team. It's actually pretty even right now in terms of the percentage of outside zone to inside zone percentage of their runs. And so therefore, I think to your point, if you are running Tank Bigsby hard between the tackles play after play, and then you bring in Travis Etienne and you run him a little bit in between the tackles, I think in turn that's going to force defenses to open up a little bit. And then that will create that space in between the tackles for him. That's where he succeeds at. And I think that it's also important to note, and this, of course, goes back to our other favorite talking point, besides can two great running backs coexist, is Trevor Lawrence a generational quarterback? Trevor Lawrence was a quote-unquote generational prospect at Clemson, and you want to know what he had? The ACC's all-time leading rusher. I think that storyline has been buried over the last 5, 6, 7 years. The reality is part of what allowed for Trevor Lawrence to be this generational prospect was Travis Etienne and the run game at Clemson. And so in what world we expected him to just emerge without that compliment, I think was, quite frankly, it was foolish of so many of us, myself included. When you look at Patrick Mahomes, no offense to Cliff Kingsbury and Texas Tech, but like, I'm sure they had a run game, but they were known as the air raid. They were known as we are a passing attack independent of if we have a run game or not. And that was never the world that Trevor Lawrence came up in. And so that's why I think that committing to the run, even regardless of the multi-million-dollar, $250 million plus deal, $200 million guarantee that you gave to Trevor Lawrence, I think that he can be that quarterback that you paid the money to if he has this going as well. And that's okay. That's allowed to be the case. Look at Matthew Stafford when he was by himself on an island in Detroit. Didn't matter how much money you threw at him. Yes, he was throwing for 4,000 yards a year, but they weren't winning football games. He goes to LA. Sean McVay is able to reinvent himself 12 times in the course of the last 3 seasons, whether it's with that young ragtag bunch last year or now when they're one of the most banged up teams in the NFL. And he's still able to find ways for Stafford to have success independent of his own skill set. And so, look, right now, the Jags, they're 3rd overall in yards per carry. You can say the Tank Bigsby inflates that stat all you want. Sure. They're top 10 in rushing EPA. They are 16th in total attempts, which to your point, Gus, and of course to Doug Peterson's point of the short passing game is an extension of the run game. Fine. That's fine. But for me, I haven't even seen enough of that short passing game, which should include, by the way, Travis Etienne and Tank Bigsby, to suggest that they are operating in that part of the field nearly enough as they should.
Well, there you have it. The Jags need to score 21 plus points likely to win this game, and they got to keep handing the ball to their 2 youngsters, the 2 shining stars of the season so far, Tank Bigsby and Brian Thomas Jr. So, Mia, you got anything else for this game? Just how do you expect it to go in general, or like a score prediction maybe, even though we focused on Jags offense versus Bears defense?
Yeah, I'll leave you guys with this. I think that the 2.5 point spread right now is interesting, largely because the Bears average 22.6 points per game and the Jaguars average 19.4 points per game. And so that 2.5 point spread is literally just covering both of their season averages and suggesting that they'll operate at the efficiency that they've been operating at through 5 weeks of the season. I think, like I noted earlier in the program, this is a Bears team that kind of found itself after week 3. I've heard that there was a meeting with the offensive operation across the board and an effort to get DeAndre Swift the football more, to learn how to run the ball so that Caleb Williams could lean on the run a little bit. Who would have thunk? Again, a quarterback needs a great run game. Who would have thought? And so I'm curious to see, number one, if we see the same Jaguars team we saw a week ago, or if that was a mirage and simply a byproduct of Gus Bradley's defense. And number two, if it's the Bears team we've seen the last 2 weeks, or if they truly were just playing inferior competition, and now it's actually a step up playing the Jaguars, and maybe they take a step back.
Yeah. The way I've been telling my friends is that I feel like this is a game that the Jaguars can win, but I don't know if they will win. It's just a much different test than it was last week against Joe Flacco and a pretty undermanned Colts secondary. So I kind of think that I'm expecting a Bears win in this one, but we'll see. Unless Brian Thomas Jr. and Tank Bigsby can kind of do their jobs and do more heavy lifting as they have this season so far. But yeah, I'm going to take the Bears and the points.
2-0 at Tottenham, though, Gus. I love that stat. I didn't even put 2 and 2 together. I will also probably take the Bears when I make my picks on helmets and heels tomorrow. I'm not going to lie, even though I have said that I would continue to pick against the Jags until they won, and then they won. So in theory, I should be picking them. But I'm not going to, because I said the same thing about the Gators, and I picked against the Gators, and the Gators won 2 games in a row. So, hey, you know what? Let's hope lightning strikes twice. The Jaguars need this one. They need next week against the Patriots as well, because if they can come home 3-4, everything that they once wanted is right back in front of them.
That is Mia O'Brien, everyone. Mia, thanks for joining the show. We'll see you on Sunday for the post-game recap of Bears versus Jaguars. It would be nice if it would be like noon or 1 or something like that. So look out for that on 1010XL. Look out for Mia on Helmets and Heels. And I don't know, she does it all for our station, so she's pretty easy to find. But thanks again, Mia, for joining.
Thank you, friends. See you on Sunday.
All right, see you Sunday. Before we get to our show and tell segment, one quick word from our sponsor. All right, let's start out with a clip from PFF's football YouTube show talking about Trayvon Walker. This is Ollie Conley, who's a great kind of X's and O's film expert.
Well, the number one thing that jumps out of Walker every time you put the film on is just the effort. He really does bring it every single down. He's playing so much. I think only TJ Watt has played more snaps than him as an edge defender this year. So even when you get to like the fourth quarter, he is still motoring and driving off the ball at a really impressive level. So that's just kind of one thing. And we are at this point now where it's just kind of like a sunk cost thing to expect him to be Aiden Hutchinson or a top tier, top 10, top 12 pass rusher. I just think we're almost beyond that point. Can he have seasons and games where he can take over and be really impactful? And can he have a year where he gets 12, 13, 14 sacks? I think there's a plausible path to that. But him being like a dictate the terms of the game to the offense type pass rusher, I think we're just beyond that. But what's really interesting with him this season is the Jags defensively, and it's no shot at Ryan Nielsen, who has been a good defensive guy around the league. They do nothing to help their guys out. You just go through the film, the figures, whatever you want. They don't blitz. They don't sim. They don't even stunt. You would think Trayvon Walker, what would be the number one thing we could do with Trayvon Walker, right, is worst case scenario, the effort, the power, we'll dive bomb him inside one time, we'll let him go outside the other time, right? That'd be like the staple go-to, put him in a Jets, Niners type system. Maybe he can cook and be a pressure type guy for us. They don't really do any of that either. They're like, bottom 3 in the league in almost every single category you look at of where can we get some extra juice up front. And the 3 times he did it against the Colts was when he was really disruptive swooping inside, and yet they just don't go to it. So this was a straight up like one-on-one tape. He's rushing off the left side almost the entire game. And so you're getting one-on-one true dropbacks. Let's find out who this guy is. And it was a really impressive performance in terms of speed to power, setting up one style of move in the first half, then try to change it in the second half to try and throw off the tackle he was facing. So it was, with what he's asked to do, that is as high and as strong as a performance that I think you can expect from him.
Ollie also talked about how Trayvon, he only really has a bull rush move. You don't see him using his hands and winning that way a ton, even in his now third year in the NFL. But as Ollie was saying later in the segment, Trayvon does or has done a good job of developing his rush plan in terms of just his tack with his bull rush, in terms of using little hesitation stutter steps and kind of opening the guy's chest and kind of having a plan of like where to attack the opposing offensive tackle on the bull rushes specifically. So he's at least shows the development there, and hopefully Ryan Nielsen will get a little bit more creative with how he's using his defensive line. This next clip is from the Campo and Joe podcast on 1010XL Jaguars YouTube, talking about what I think is the biggest weakness for the Jaguars so far this season, their safety room.
I was really struggling. From a defensive standpoint, the safeties, Antonio Johnson is struggling.
Yeah.
And, he made some tackles. He's good as a up front run defender.
Yes.
That's it. When he's back in the back end, he's not a good open field tackler, which really hurts them when you're playing soft zone, when you have to come up and make tackles.
Yeah.
He's not good at that. He's made some mistakes. He got beat by the tight end one-on-one, the first score in the fourth quarter that really kind of got things going.
Yeah.
And Cisco, they're just not playing very well. He's not overlapping very well. He's not in great position all the time. He is a good blitzer. He's another guy up around the line of scrimmage isn't bad. But when he's back there, right now they're putting him up front and letting Antonio Johnson play middle safety, and that's not his strength.
That doesn't make sense, does it?
They're really struggling. I think they're both struggling.
So, I don't have anything more to add. Jag Shorts talk, I see your comments. We're going to get to those soon. I've got one more video clip and then just one graphic to show. This is Trevor Lawrence yesterday talking about just the comparisons between Brian Thomas Jr. and then his former Clemson teammates, Justin Ross and T. Higgins. Video from
T. Higgins and Justin Ross, two big, tall receivers, can go up and get the ball. Is that similar to what you have in Brian Thomas? I know Brian's a little bit faster than those two guys.
Yeah, I mean, it's the length for sure helps. I think that's just a bonus. There's a lot of other important traits when it comes to playing receiver, and speed's one of them. Understanding defenses, how to get open versus certain looks. I think all those things are as important, if not more important. But the extra length always helps. You can go up and get the contested passes. If the DB covers it well, you still have that extra length to go get it. So I think that just helps. But those three guys are really different in my mind of how they play and their style. But yeah, I think having the length on the outside really it does help for sure.
Can you elaborate on how maybe Brian's different from those guys? His style?
I think obviously, like you said, Brian's faster than those guys. I think T can run, though. He's faster than you'd think. He's really smooth, but he's also big. Like, T's a heavier guy. He's probably, I don't know how you guys, I'm sure you could look it up, but he looks like he's like 220 or something. Like, he's a bigger guy, really physical. I do think see some similarities between Brian and T as far as like after the catch, breaking tackles and just really slippery. Like, that's something. And then Justin Ross was more of like you remember how Calvin is like, can slam his foot in the ground and stop on a dime. Like, that was Justin had that ability. That was a little bit different. And just as far as route running and being able to stop on a dime and stick and go the other way and turn DBs around, like, that was kind of his thing. So they're all a little bit different, and Brian definitely runs routes a little different than those guys. But yeah.
Last thing I have to show you guys is just the Wednesday injury report. Let's go through it. Jaquan Brisker for the Bears, as we talked about, has already been ruled out with a concussion. The Bears also have defensive lineman Zach Pickens and Terrell Smith not practicing. I believe all three of those players will not be making the trip to London. And then Kyler Gordon was limited on Wednesday with a heel injury. Offensive lineman Tevin Jenkins was limited with an ankle injury. And defensive lineman Jacob Martin had a toe injury, but he practiced in full. And so Kyler Gordon and Tevin Jenkins, two Bears to look out for and monitor their injuries this week. For the Jaguars, Tyson Campbell was placed on the designated to return from injured reserve list, and he got in a limited practice on Wednesday, returning from his hamstring injury. Travis Etienne was limited with a shoulder. Darnell Savage was limited with a quad. Devin Lloyd was limited with a knee. Yasir Abdullah was limited with a neck. Evan Engram was limited with a hamstring. Gabe Davis was limited with a knee. And Daniel Thomas was limited with a hamstring. But I would expect all of those players to play. And the last bit of news is that punt returner Devin Duvernay, who had a 52 or 53-yard punt return last week against the Colts, he was placed on injured reserve with, I believe, a shoulder injury. Kate asked, where's Parker Washington? I don't know if Parker Washington has an injury. Let me look that up real quick. What did he injure, Kate? Parker Washington injury. I'm not seeing anything recent, so I don't think Parker Washington is hurt. Duval TV asked, will Parker be the new returner? That's a good question. I think it'll probably be I guess for punt returning, it probably will be Parker. And then for kick returning, I think it'll end up being Tank Bigsby and who else? Dearness Johnson. I think they've got those two as their next two kick returners. But yeah, Parker Washington could be the punt returner now that now that Devin Duvernay is on injured reserve. So let's see. It's time for some chat therapy. Let's see what comments you guys had. Kate said earlier, good morning from the Southwest. Good morning from the Southeast. Cade asked, how are you going to protect Trevor from the Bears' pass rush? I think just by getting the ball out quickly. I don't think it's really anything different this week compared to what we've seen them plan in the past, especially since obviously Montez Sweat is a problem. We've noted Gervin Dexter too, defensive tackle from Florida, but they don't really have anyone as scary as like the Texans had in week 4, the Bills even had in week 3, or the Browns had in week 2. And so I think it'll be kind of similar to what we've seen in the past again, where it's getting the ball out quickly, using the running game to kind of slow down the pass rush, using play action, maybe chipping every once in a while, but really the Jags don't chip a lot. They do leave their offensive tackles on islands a decent amount. So more than anything else, it's just going to need to be a third straight strong performance from Cam Robinson and Anton Harrison. Jag Short Stock said, I want to see Jordan Jefferson. Haven't seen any interior pressure. Come on. Jordan Jefferson, please. He's the answer. Most powerful guy on the team. Lags agrees. Jeff Lagman, I suppose, is saying this. Lagman? I think it's Lagman. But yeah, I don't know. Jordan Jefferson is a 4th-round rookie out of LSU who's projected to go more in like the 6th or the 7th round. And so I don't really think it's a big deal that we haven't seen him playing much at this time. I don't really have anything else much to say. I'm not in the building a lot these days, only really for press conferences and games. And so I haven't learned anything to tell you. So I would just say be patient with a 4th-round rookie. But yeah, maybe we'll see Jordan Jefferson playing a little bit more in the second half of the season. Jag Shorts Talk said, Buster Brown over Darby. Buster Brown has been really solid. I agree. I've been saying that even including last year when Tyson Campbell was also dealing with a hamstring at that point, Buster has been really good and done everything you could ask for him coming in as a backup cornerback. But I'm not going to take the Darby slander. I know that Darby hasn't been very good over the past 2 weeks, especially, and against Nico Collins in week 4. But I don't know. I think Darby is a good pro. I was a really big fan of his in free agency even before he signed with Jacksonville. And so I think that he's kind of in a tough spot because we already have talked about how the safety room has been a weakness for the Jaguars this season. And then obviously Tyson is out. Foye Oluokun is on injured reserve as well. And by the way, Doug Peterson, I think, said that they're probably looking at a week 7 return for Foye Oluokun, but we'll still have to wait and see when he's going to return from his foot injury. But yeah, Buster Brown definitely deserves a shout out, but I don't think Darby deserves any slander either. Jacob commented earlier, next step in BTJ's game is getting those 50-50 rebounds Trevor hasn't been able to cut loose on. Yeah, I agree. I don't think that contested catching is necessarily Thomas's forte, at least not the way that you see like a T. Higgins or a DeAndre Hopkins really be able to just run hip to hip with a defender and then still be able to just catch the ball in a super tight space. Not saying that Thomas Jr. can't do that yet, but that like he's more so just he does have length, but the length helps out just like with a catch radius as opposed to contested catches, if that makes sense. But yeah, the next step for him and for Trevor is to be able to connect on just those connected just contested 50-50 shots. Let's see what else we got. 100 miles per hour asked earlier, do you see Doug being canned after London? I think if they go 0-2 in London, then yeah, maybe. I've always said that I thought the earliest that Doug would get canned would be after they return from London. But at this point, I don't know. I don't know. Unless they go 0-2 in London, I feel like Doug could be around until the bye week or even until just the season ends. Just see what he can do for the year. 100 mile per hour also asked, if Tyson plays, do we see Darby and Buster? And could you see us eventually putting Darnell at safety? Yeah, so Tyson Campbell would not be playing this game, but once he comes back, I expect the starting cornerbacks to be Tyson Campbell and Ronald Darby on the outside, with Darnell Savage continuing to be the slot man. But I think that is an interesting theory, is having Darnell at safety, because even though he's been playing well in the nickel this year for Jacksonville, he does have a good amount of experience playing safety in the past 4 or 5 years with Green Bay. And so I think that's a possible solution to the safety room's woes so far this season, is moving Darnell into that spot and then having, I don't know, then you'd have to fill the nickel position out. I guess you'd maybe put Jarian Jones there if you're comfortable with that, but I don't know if I would be, at least in passing situations like 3rd and longs and stuff like that. But I think DeShaun Gibson Sr., who was suspended by the NFL for 6 games, so he'll be eligible to return in Week 7. The Jaguars did get permission from the NFL to bring Gibson on their London trip, similar to what they did with Cam Robinson last year. And so I think we'll see DeShaun Gibson playing in Week 7, and I think that honestly Gibson might end up starting sooner than later, just if Antonio Johnson or Andre Cisco is able to start playing better soon. Storm the Desert said ESPN says the Lions should trade for Trayvon, 2 4th-rounders, LMFAO. Yeah, that was a Ben Solak article, and I put Solak stuff on here in the show and tell segment before because he's great. But yeah, it was a pretty interesting take saying the Lions should get Trayvon. I think it was more so, I think part of the reason Jags fans are like, oh, that's a ridiculous trade offer, is first of all giving up a former 1st overall pick for kind of peanuts. Obviously, it makes a lot more sense for Trayvon to stay in Jacksonville and just develop as much as he can, especially as long as Trent Baalke stays in town, since he's the guy that drafted Trayvon. And it just doesn't make sense to get rid of him this early, again, for just 2 4th-rounders. And then it's also weird to give him to the Lions, who drafted Aiden Hutchinson, the pick after Trayvon Walker back in 2022. And I think the point that Solak was really just trying to make is that Trayvon Walker is like the type of player that the Lions really need for their defense, and that the Lions should look out for during the trade deadline, which is kind of a guy who just does a lot of dirty work for the defense. But they already have the Lions, the kind of their star pass rusher in Aiden Hutchinson. But if they can get more of a gritty behind-the-scenes guy like Walker, who's really good against the run, especially on early downs, and then could kind of just be like your power rusher, just disruptor, stunt guy against the pass rush, then yeah, I do think that Trayvon Walker and Aiden Hutchinson would be a good tandem, but I also don't blame Jaguars fans for thinking it was kind of an absurd mock offer. Jag Short Talk asked, thoughts on Chad Muma? He's played better than he did last season. He looks more confident, and kind of like what we've seen from Devin Lloyd, just as he's been more confident and kind of thinking less, he's able to go out there and play a little bit more free and play just more in a rhythm, whatever. But yeah, I think Ventrell Miller has honestly been the most impressive Jaguars linebacker, not named Foye Oluokun, this season. Foye has been outstanding, especially in pass coverage, where he's always been really good in run defense. And not that he was bad in pass coverage, but really started turning it on this season before his injury. And then Ventrell has really flashed, especially after recovering from tearing his Achilles last year as a rookie. And so Muma, again, he's improved, especially with just the confidence and being able to know where to go on spots, which is impressive considering the Jags do have a new defensive coordinator and play caller. But yeah, I also haven't seen anything from Muma that's like crazy flashes. I know he had some great flashes in the preseason, but he's kind of slowed down a little bit since then. And so it's been, I don't know. He has been not very noticeable in not a good or a bad way, I suppose. Duval TV said, I'm excited for DeShaun Gibson. Any word on Dewey by chance? Yeah, I think Dewey will also be ready to return in around week 7 or week 8. So before Jacksonville's week 9 bye. I'm pretty sure their bye is week 9. And so Dewey is going to be big for the safety depth and, of course, for special teams since he's a core 4 special teamer. But I don't know. I think if the Jaguars were going to switch up the starters in their safety position, then they'll be more likely to go to an experienced guy like Gibson than kind of like a special teams leader like Andrew Wingard. Storm the Desert said, with secondary being washed and hurt, do you see us blitzing more to help out with coverage? No, if anything, it's more just like the type of coverage is being switched, like where it's less man-to-man, where guys are having to kind of win, not necessarily on islands all the time, but they have to win one-on-one a lot more and more towards zone defenses where it's just makes more sense to go when you have less talent than the offense does. So we've seen a lot more just like coverage mix-ups than we have blitzing mix-ups. Nielsen's unit has actually blitzed at like the 3rd lowest rate in the NFL, I think, this season. Not blitzing a lot. So that's something, again, that Ollie Connolly was talking about in one of the clips that I showed earlier. And so we'll see. I think it kind of depends on the type of quarterback, because when you go against Josh Allen or CJ Stroud or even Joe Flacco, who's a pretty established veteran and just an experienced veteran, then maybe you don't want to send a ton of blitzes their way, but maybe Nielsen will mix it up this week against a rookie quarterback and Caleb Williams and try to blitz him a little bit more. We got Rick Blue fan saying, is Blue coming on? Put Blue at free safety. Guy can cover it all. I don't disagree. I will try my best to have Rick on soon. I think Rick and Leon Searcy are the 2 people I'm planning on having on for the next 2 Tuesday shows. Not sure what order it'll be in, but yeah, try to have Rick on soon. But that'll do it for today. Thank you to everyone who joined. See you next time for Duval Rundown on Sunday after the Bears-Jaguars game that kicks off on 9:30 a.m. Eastern on Sunday, again, at Tottenham Hotspur Stadium. So, yeah, until then, see you guys next time. Thanks for joining.